and welcome to the April 19th, 2023 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this work session to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. We have a great topic today, and I wanted to just say a couple of opening comments before I turn it over to Denny, because we don't typically bring department work plans to the city council. That's just not a thing, but it has been historically in the past. PDD has been here even prior to my being in an executive role. That was true. Part of the reason why we're here today is that the planning and development services are in very high demand. It occupies a large percent of your agenda. If you look out like PDD, if we color code it, he's winning a prize. It's also an area where we have been increasingly impacted by regulations coming down from the state. And so I think it is really important that we think about how we clarify expectations, set expectations, because I think, work session polls get passed or motions get passed. And then I get a lot of like, where is this? Where is this? Where is this? When is this coming back? We typically try to have an abundance mindset. However, as you know, next week, we're going to start into the budget and we're not actually in an abundant time. And so we will try to be really creative about how we do things and how we stage work. But I think as you think through your priorities, becomes increasingly important for us to understand where things sit and how we can communicate with the public so that everybody feels like, promises made, promises kept. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denny.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Denny Breaux, Planning and Development Director. We're going to combine a couple of topics today, and Sarah mentioned the work plan. But in response to a council poll requesting a discussion about future Bethel and University neighborhood planning work, as well in the context of our work plan, we're going to talk about kind of both of those things. And if you recall, a few years ago, Council indicated that the next two neighborhoods that we were going to work through were University neighborhood followed by Bethel, and there was a poll that requested reconsideration of that order. So that's kind of one of the reasons that we're here today. But the poll also requested a discussion for that discussion to occur within the context of our overall planning work plan. But neighborhood planning is more than just planning. So, and we have a lot in the work plan. So we took the opportunity to expand that to include all of planning and development's work plan. And as you'll see, we'll be highlighting a bunch of other work plan items in the queue, not just neighborhood planning. So here's what we're going to cover. I'll start out by talking about planning and development in our work plan, and then I'll hand it over to Alyssa to talk about some future work plan items, including future neighborhood planning. So as Sarah indicated, in planning and development, we do a lot of important work with council and the community. We have a lot of agenda items. We take a lot of space in your world, take up a lot of space on the agenda. And I'll just call to your attention the attached summary of work plan items that was in the packet. And it's not a work plan. I think it's clear that it's a list, but it's a list of the various things that are on our various teams' work plans. So for most of this work, we actually have active work plans that we're working through and so forth. So our intent was not to show detailed mapped out tasks and timelines for each one of these, but rather we'll mostly focus on those future work plan items that we really haven't quite figured out yet, including the future neighborhood planning work. When you look at the entire list, it's a long list. We're actually not looking for a prize. We're not looking for sympathy. And, our expectation is not that council prioritizes all of these today, because again, it's a really long list. And frankly, we just haven't figured out how to get through all of this work, especially some of that future work that we really haven't started working on yet. So our hope today is that as we navigate all these, we can collectively figure out as we go down the road how to prioritize, put these in a queue in a timely manner, and maybe get some efficiencies by clustering things together, folding them into other efforts that we're working on. which we'll talk about here in a little while. So I just want to start with a little bit of a quick overview of planning and development. Since we're here, we thought we might reintroduce ourselves. We have 4 divisions, planning, community development, building permit services, and our administration division. Our full leadership team is actually here with us today. Alyssa Hanson, our planning director, Will Dowdy, community development director, Lydia Bishop, building permit services director, Jeff Petrie is our admin division manager, and Lindsay Seltzer is always also here, is our communications and engagement manager. In planning and development, we always talk about us being in the city building business. And our goal really is to build a city that is better tomorrow than it is today. That's really simple, but I think it's pretty much speaks volumes about why we're here. And we do that by planning what our city is going to look like in the future, offering programs and services that implement those plans. We permit the things that build and advance our city, and then we maintain the livability of those things in that built environment after we build it. And that's really kind of the crux of what happens in planning and development. So you have a list of work plan items that we provided in the attachment, and it's really organized in 3 groups, kind of our core everyday ongoing programs and services, and then kind of current initiatives and projects. Those are the things that we have active involvement with council. We have a lot of council work and agenda items on those current things that we're working through. Those are things that we've mostly figured out. In other words, they're in process. We have the resources and the staff that kind of are figuring out how to work through those, but we're trying to stick the landing on all of those before we kind of move on to a whole bunch of other things. So that's one group of work. And then future projects really are the things that are also going to involve a lot of council work, but really they haven't really fully come to you, or they haven't been on the agenda yet, or we're trying to wedge them into the work plan as we go down the road. So but the first grouping of the work plan items is really our core planning and development services and ongoing programs. And we can't forget about these because this is really how most of our staff spend their time. So generally, these are the things that don't require a significant amount of council discussion or actions. And if they do, they tend to be more routine. There's approximately 50 core service functions on that list, and plus 10 committees, commissions, and advisory panels that we oversee in planning and development. And this really all is our daily activity. So this is how most of our 130 staff spend their day within these core services. And as you can see, the work is diverse. We have 23 different funds in planning and development, and a majority of the funding in planning and development is actually not general fund. It's special funds like building permit services fund, parking funds, federal funds, et cetera, et cetera. And as we talk through this presentation, we'll be highlighting a lot of things that happen in planning, like neighborhood planning. And I'll just note that they are our smallest division, and it's pretty much 100% general fund. So there's some limitations in the planning department. Much of that daily work is the things that align directly, I think, with council's and the community's stated priorities around housing, homelessness, climate, and safety. And if you throw economic development into that equation, which I think you have to if you're talking about housing affordability. So things like land use permits, subdivisions, partitioning, growth monitoring. We operate numerous downtown and economic development and housing programs. For example, we'll oversee about $6 million in affordable housing funding over the next 2 years that are intended to bring forward about 250 new affordable housing units. Our homeless services team continues to initiate and oversees our shelter programs. We issue building and permits, and on average, it's about $500 million of construction activity each year that we oversee the permitting process. Last year, our staff conducted 58,000 inspections. That's about 230 a day. And a lot of this work is related to housing production, and of course, that's a community priority. So that work's very important. Other services like parking, waste prevention, code compliance, downtown operations, those address the livability and the safety of community. So again, those kind of fit squarely within our priorities. In the attachment, kind of the second grouping of projects are our current projects. And I won't spend too much time on these because You should be aware of most of them. They're active. You've had work sessions. And for the most part, we have a plan to move through this work. But again, there are many items captured on this current project list. And again, most of them, almost all of them squarely fit right into those list of council priorities. And so therefore we're acting to work to try to finish, we call it stick the landing on that group of work so that we can then go move on to other things that are important as well. Within the current work of projects, there's several major items that you will recognize: downtown urban rural plan amendments, all of the riverfront redevelopment work and plan amendments, renter protections, urban growth boundary work, the mandated climate friendly equitable communities work, finishing River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan. And we're starting to think about how we move the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Business Council and Economic Development forward as well. And I think it's important to note that although this is current work in the work plan and it's in process, there's still a lot of work to be done. And we've done a little forecasting on just this group of work here that you see here. And there's at least council work sessions embedded in this current work that we're working on. And that doesn't include public hearings and action, kind of Monday evening action items that are done to finish this work. That's really kind of work session items. So it's a lot. The next grouping that you'll see in the list is future projects. And it represents several priority items that you have expressed an interest in also moving forward or have brought forward via council polls. Many of them not yet been kind of fully found their way into our work plan or onto the agenda. And our challenge really, as we look at these projects, is we're currently trying to stick the landing on the current work that we're working on. We're looking at for opportunities to kind of wedge those items into the other work, and that can be challenging at time. We're looking at ways to try to cluster these items into other existing work that we're doing or other future work so we get more efficiencies. And for some of the bigger items, we're trying to really figure out how to resource them and how to financially support those efforts, because that can be challenging, as Sarah mentioned, in our current environment as well. So finally, before I hand it over to Alyssa, we started to look at some strategies to cluster this work, especially the future agenda items, and strategic ways that will allow us to make some progress on them, because I know that's important. And when you look at these, there are some themes and categories that emerge that I think tie some of them together and inform how we might cluster the work. There are generally 4 kind of organizing themes as we looked at this: housing, climate, livability, and downtown and economic development. And you can kind of see how some of these cluster under those 4 categories. For example, climate friendly, transportation corridor planning, the 3 council work session requests regarding gas stations, tree preservation, solar access. They kind of clustered together in an efficient way, maybe under climate. And you can see how some of the other things kind of cluster as well. So with that, I'm going to transition this to Alyssa and have her talk a little bit more in detail about how we see some of these future items being kind of bundled together and having some strategies how we move them forwards. And to talk about neighborhood planning as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Denny. Alyssa Hanson, Planning Director. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. As Denny mentioned, there are a lot of ways to look at this future list of projects. Kind of in and of itself, it's a bit unwieldy if you're just looking at the attachment. How are we going to capture those? How are we going to move through them? Denny showed you kind of some themes, and then what we did is we took those themes and thought about them in the context of some of our existing projects and programs, which are shown here: climate friendlies and equitable communities, implementation, housing implementation pipeline, neighborhood planning, and other. I'm going to walk through these, although I'm going to reverse the bottom 2 because that makes for a better transition into the neighborhood planning topic. So I'll just jump right in. Starting with the climate friendly and equitable communities. As you know, it's a state adopted rules that we are required to comply with. There are a number of components, some of which you've heard about already and are listed in our current projects. This particular, the scenario planning, compact development code amendments, that package isn't due until later. And so it's really kind of another phase of the climate friendly. So, and it's something that we'll be working really closely with Public Works Transportation. So because that one's not due until later. We're not as concerned about the resourcing for this one at the moment. And then gas stations, as you'll recall, this was a council work session request to discuss prohibiting or limiting the locations of gas stations within the city. We think that this really nests well within the climate theme or the climate friendly and equitable communities components. And so we're looking where we could fit an initial work session in with some of the climate related work. And if desired, it would maybe possible to fold this into some of the climate friendly code amendments, because down the road, we definitely are gonna, with the different components and projects, there will be code amendments involved in those. So that's one way where we could find some efficiencies and bundle this particular item. The next set kind of come under the heading of Housing Implementation Pipeline, or the HIP, which, as you recall, was as our internal five-year housing work plan that council approved. Within the HIP, there are a lot of projects that are already listed in some of our ongoing work and in some of the current projects. This is more of a catch-all for some of those other projects that we're trying to figure out how to resource for those. One example would be incentives for middle housing that was listed in the HIP. It is not a current project, so there are a number of HIP projects that we'll be looking for, efficiencies on when and where we can move forward with those. Downtown Riverfront affordable housing site. So there is a site set aside for affordable housing, the downtown Riverfront development area. That particular one is waiting on a broader conversation with the Riverfront Urban Renewal District, which is anticipated for later this year. Short-term rentals. This came up in the context of middle housing, and that was a council request for a work session. We think it's a little early at this point to move forward with that because the middle housing code amendments haven't been in place that long. And if you'll recall, the concern was that middle housing would just, flip instantly to short-term rentals, and that would have an impact on our housing. The good news is we have a robust monitoring program, and we also have the STR registration. So we'll be able to, kind of do some monitoring to see how that's working out and come back to you later with more information. And then finally, the key transportation and corridor planning, although that's listed as being a HIP component, it's been around longer than that. And it's really one of our key strategies from Envision Eugene. And we're doing that in a number of different ways. So it's not necessarily its own project. We're looking for ways to advance that strategy as part of climate friendly, which I'm going to start calling CFEC. Otherwise, it's going to make the meeting too long. So within CFEC, and then also within the urban growth boundary work and some of our housing work as well will help advance those goals. And as I mentioned, I was going to jump to the other category. I'm just going to hit a couple of these. I think you're familiar with, well, hopefully familiar with most of them. In terms of the livability code, this is something that was directed by council. We've moved forward with the first phase, and what's remaining is addressing derelict buildings and properties, and then those difficult to resolve nuisance cases. And so that will be some code to address that. I'm going to jump to the Clear Lake wetland inventory. That's really a housekeeping item that follows up after our UGB adoption. It's just something we need to complete. And then jumping down to tree preservation and solar access standards, similar to short-term rentals, those came out of the middle housing conversations. Just concern. I think, at that point, the concern was middle housing, but I think the concern is probably broader in terms of residential. I will mention that trees are being addressed in the Willamette Greenway code amendments, which you'll be having a work session on next month. And then our idea here is to simmer a little bit longer on these because of the conversations going on at the state legislature around wildfire protection prevention, and removal of barriers to housing. So we really want to see what's going to come out of the state before we advance something that may be counter to those, or at least to give us an idea of what the goals will be of any new state legislation before we move forward with these. And then the last kind of category is neighborhood planning. I'm going to get to University and Bethel in a minute, so I want to jump to the public health overlay concept. As you may recall, we had a work session in the fall on this topic about public health overlay. It was public health overlay zone and other tools to address pollution from industries and in proximity to residential. And really, as I think you all know, the impetus was really about the Baxter situation and how there's heavy industrial just across the street from residential property and, the impacts of that. So there had been an overlay zone introduced by some community members, and in our conversation in the fall, we talked about that there could be other tools that could achieve some of those same outcomes. And so really our intent is to bring you a proposal soon that addresses the most pressing concern, which is that proximity of, new industrial, that could be a polluter in proximity to residential. And so the concept would be to not allow the siting of certain industries within proximate to residential. And this could happen through a code amendment instead of a rezoning. And we believe that could be done quicker and within our existing resources. And ideally, we'd be able to bring this come back to you after we finish the Willamette Greenway Code amendments, which are scheduled for this summer. And then I know that there is more interest in, other material in the proposal by the community members, and that could probably be folded into the neighborhood planning. Which brings me to my next slide on neighborhood planning. And as Denny mentioned, that this is really the main impetus for the work session, which is to discuss neighborhood planning and the question posed by Councilor Evans, which is to discuss moving the Bethel to the top neighborhood planning priority. So the agenda item summary includes the full work session request, at least an excerpt of it. And I've listed the outcomes here that were from Councilor Evans' poll. So in terms of neighborhood planning, our current project is in River Road, Santa Clara, and we are hard at work on that one. Neighborhood planning has been there underway since after the urban growth boundary was adopted. Prior to that, the community members actually put in a tremendous amount of time and effort in capacity building, getting themselves ready to be able to fully participate in that project, and also identifying priorities and goals. And that really laid the foundation for the project that's occurring now. We are putting the finishing touches on an actual draft plan and code amendments, and working on actually setting up the outreach that will happen in advance of the formal adoption process. And that formal adoption process, which includes planning commission hearing and recommendation and council hearing and action, that is anticipated. Actually, it also includes Lane County, that is anticipated to begin this fall. So we are really focused and committed to sticking the landing, as Denny said. And then next in the queue for neighborhood planning are University and Bethel. And University area is really, at least initially, as anticipated, to address the interface between the University of Oregon and those surrounding neighborhoods. Although I will say there's been no scoping to know exactly what boundaries would be included in that particular plan. And then the intent of Bethel is really to build off the work that was done in building a better Bethel. Money has been allocated to both of these planning efforts for capacity building. And that has been, waiting to be used when it's ripe. In terms of neighborhood planning, planning itself has had or at least in Eugene, we have a long history of neighborhood planning. And that's really been a constant theme over at least the last 5 decades. I think our oldest plan is potentially that old. But I do want to highlight that there has been a shift in the legal landscape and planning practices to really focus on citywide efforts. And so if you think about the middle housing code amendments, those were really at a citywide scale. The climate friendly and equitable communities parking reform is really looking at things at a citywide scale. So really just the legal landscape is having us pull back some of our planning. So it's happening at that higher level. And this came up during River Road in terms of they had some ideas about where they wanted to see middle housing, but because of the new state law, that wasn't an option. And so I guess my point in all of that is that neighborhood planning is going to look a little bit different going forward. It's not going to look like some of our traditional refinement plans that we've seen. We still have the opportunities to address the unique character and nature of neighborhoods, but it may be more of an action plan and less on land use regulation. I really think, we've really been talking about how it really will be a collaboration with parks and transportation and safe routes to school, and how do we incentivize the types of economic development we want to see in these neighborhoods? Where do street trees needed, and kind of just that kind of comprehensive planning of that variety, but kind of in an action plan kind of way. So it will probably look and feel different than maybe what we're used to, but it will be attached to outcomes. And I really think that really will allow us to be more nimble as we move forward with these. But most importantly, it will still allow us to address the unique nature and important concerns of the neighborhoods. And with that, I'm just going to be done.
Stuck the landing.
Yeah.
That was a phenomenal performance of a huge amount of information encapsulated in a very discrete form. And I want to thank you deeply, because when I first looked at that bulleted list, I was sort of like, well, how do I make sense of this? And so I really want to appreciate how you have made sense of that list for us, and really, really helpful. I have questions, but I know counselors do. So Randy, take it away. Randy, then Matt, then Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Alyssa and Denny, for the presentation. As far as the public health overlay zone, or whatever we want to call it as we move forward, how much of what's in the Clear Lake zone can be applied to that?
That is a really good question, and not one that we've spent a lot of time looking at. I will say Clear Lake is a greenfield site. There's no development out there, where as opposed to within this, within the city limits, if you think along West, in West Eugene, there are existing developments. So we would really need to think about those differences and those impacts to how it would impact existing development. And the other things that we would need to consider is I think the Chamber of Commerce is going to want to be interested in that as well. And we'll need to look to make sure that we're not prohibiting some of our targeted industries, which is, what we said that we really need here in Eugene through the urban growth boundary process. But to be honest, we haven't done I don't think the intent was that for Clear Lake to just be immediately transferable. It was really done specifically for that greenfield expansion area. There probably are some parts we can pull out of it, but I wouldn't recommend wholesale just applying it to new areas.
I'm not recommending or asking for wholesale application, but it does seem, when I look at the two concepts, that there is quite a bit of overlap, and especially when it comes to distances and buffer zones between industry, residential, parks, and schools. And, the concept with the FAWS is that it's not precluding industry, but trying to have kind of a step down from some of the heavier industry with even some commercial in between. So there is a buffer space between that and more sensitive land uses. Okay, and then kind of moving along with that, when did the university area last receive a neighborhood area plan update?
So this is what's interesting about our neighborhood plans. There's probably like 16 or 17 of them, and they don't necessarily follow neighborhood boundaries. So there is one for West University. I'm not sure it follows the neighborhood boundary. There's one in Fairmont. There's not one in South University. And then Amazon is sort of covered by South Hills, and then along Franklin is covered by Walnut, and those have a variety of dates.
You know, I don't remember specifically, but before I took office, you know, I watched as a city staff person, and I know that that area has received quite a bit of attention. How about Bethel?
Bethel's plan, I did just check that one, is from 1982.
1982. Okay, that's more recent than I thought, but it's still considerably older. The touch was longer ago than what we've seen in the university area, and we do have some problems out there that would be nice to address. And you know, Bethel is they feel ignored, and to a certain extent they have been, and they're feeling a sense of, you know, wanting to take control of their neighborhoods and how they develop out there. And, you know, I think it's really important we find a way to get something in the queue sooner rather than later to help move this forward. Thank you. That's all I have at this time.
Okay, thank you. Matt, then Jennifer, then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I echo the mayor's sentiment and comments. Going into this, I had a lot more questions, but you have helped answer them throughout this presentation. I'm going to start with neighborhood planning because that was last. And then I may ask for a second round, but there's 16 or 17 neighborhood plans that you mentioned. Just out of curiosity, why aren't the neighborhood plans aligned with the neighborhood associations? What's the rationale there? What's the thinking?
You know, that is a really good question. I will say most of them predate my time. And in a lot of cases, it's been less about the neighborhood boundary and then what's the area that really needs to be addressed. Some of them are considered special area zones, even though we'll call them a neighborhood plan. So it depends on what they're really addressing in a lot of cases.
I assume that there's engagement with the neighborhood associations to get some buy-in, feedback, et cetera.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
That'll
absolutely.
come up again in my series of questions. How long does it take to develop, plan, and implement a full-fledged neighborhood plan or special area zone?
Well, let me take the first part. In terms of how long does it take? I can tell, well, here's our most recent. So with River Road, we're about 5 years in. I will say we had a pandemic in the middle of that, and you know, a big change in state law that really made us have to rethink some things. So that one we're working on 5 years. Our intent would be to do them quicker than that. Absolutely, because we're never going to get through all of them in if you're at 5 years at a time.
Yep.
And then the second part of your question, can you repeat it?
How long does it take to develop, plan, and implement a full-fledged neighborhood plan?
Okay, so it's, you know, it can be anywhere from 2 to 5 years to develop the plan. In terms of implementing it, I mean, some of them are really long range things that are, you know, they're ongoing, and sometimes we don't make it to every action. I would say most times we don't make it to every single item that's listed in a neighborhood plan.
Again, picking up what Councilor Groves was putting down, next in the queue, looks like University and then Bethel. Are those being proposed to happen at the same time?
No.
So it may make sense, and I suspect there'll be enthusiasm from my colleagues to maybe perhaps flip those. Could you talk about, well, I'll wait to that motion. So if next in the queue are University and Bethel in no particular order based on a potential motion that could be in front of us, what follows University and Bethel?
That would be up to council to direct.
Okay.
We could come with ideas for sure.
There's nothing at this juncture.
Nothing at this juncture. Those are the two that are next in line.
Okay, that's helpful. And it may be helpful, just for my edification, to know maybe the last 10 to 20 years, what's been executed, what's been implemented. I'm relatively new on council in my third year. So it would just having that history over the.
Are you talking about what plans?
Yeah, what
have
plans,
been?
right.
Okay, boy.
I don't necessarily need it now.
Okay, good.
But I would welcome that information.
Okay.
And then finally, I assume that the urban design program falls squarely in the neighborhood planning bucket. Is that accurate?
The urban design is actually its own program and it works on the neighborhood planning. It helps community development. It actually touches a wide range of projects, but neighborhood planning is one of the things that falls under that.
Okay. Are there conversations to utilize community input or expert advice regarding urban design, aesthetics, character, setback, utilization of greenery or green space, et cetera? I bring it up because there are other communities along the West Coast that have an urban design committee. And if I look at the 10 commissions or committees that the planning and development department work with, I don't see one necessarily around urban design. Are there conversations with your team about taking that step or utilizing that expertise?
I'll start real
Good.
quick because I'm not sure which communities you're referencing, but some cities, especially larger cities, have urban design standards that go through review. So you see some of those communities that have design expertise committees that review the urban design of specific projects. We don't actually have urban design guidelines, and so we have guidelines, but we don't have requirements. It's with the exception of those that are embedded in the code. So that might be a differentiating factor, but maybe Alyssa can.
Yeah, and let me add on to that. So for instance, I know Portland has a robust design review program. They also have a call out in state law that allows them to do that in certain areas, because for housing, we have to have clear and objective standards. We couldn't just bring, a housing plan or, an apartment building to a board and have them pick it apart. It would have to be, does it meet these clear and objective criteria in the code? And that's kind of one of the reasons we haven't gone with the design review, is because, we do have pretty robust standards in our code and they need to be clear and objective.
Okay. Well, I only have 16 seconds left, Mayor. I may take a second round, but I enthusiastically look forward to tree preservation work session, gas station work sessions, and the public health overlay concept, either citywide or immediately in Bethel, and time.
Well done,
Thanks.
well done. Okay, Jennifer, then Alan, and then I have Mike, Greg, and Lindsay in the queue.
Thank you. You guys went over a lot in a very short presentation. So
Sorry.
that's okay. I'm going to try to go through all the things I wrote. We'll see if we make it. So my first question was on, you talked about short-term rentals, and I think your reason why you're taking a little pause right now makes sense to see how the middle housing code, but what does later mean? Because we did kind of tell the community, give us some time. We're gonna track it. We're gonna get good data, and then we're gonna bring it back. And I want to make sure that doesn't just get lost for those people that do have some issues.
I'm not sure exactly when we'll have the data. I know we have looked at data. There's two issues around short-term rentals that have been expressed. One is the impact on the housing supply, which is important. And then just, I don't know, behavior, aesthetics, neighborhood livability, nuisance, all those things. Since we initiated the registration program, we've been able to connect complaints and short-term rentals. We've had very few complaints. I think the number is 9 since we've implemented. So I think that issue, at least we could cast aside and say, there's not a big problem there that we need to fix. We're not sure if the other part of that, the housing supply issue, is actually a real problem or not, because we don't necessarily have had enough time to see the impacts, and we don't necessarily have all the data. So I think the answer to that would be when we have a little bit more data, which I guess I would look at Alyssa on growth monitoring, all the other data kind of stuff we're collecting.
Right. I mean, we'll have another growth monitoring report in June, but that will be for last year. And so we're not going to have, it's because it was adopted in the middle of last year, we're not going to have a lot of data probably until later this year at the earliest. And it also is going to depend on, how much folks are building middle housing.
Right. Okay, so a while
Later,
maybe
yeah.
a year-ish.
Yeah, I
Okay,
think that.
so I won't bug you. I will.
Okay.
But
I think a year will give us more data that will be helpful.
then you can remind me if I bug you. Remember, you told me a year. Okay. let's see, what was my other question? You were talking about how planning, plans will change, neighborhood plannings will change. And this is not a question, it's more of a comment. It occurs to me that change to more of an action oriented, instead of just zone change plan would really fit what the Bethel area needs, maybe a little more closely than the university area, because I think what they're hoping to do is not just land use changes, right? They're really trying to think about their neighborhood and how it can thrive into the future. So I actually think that's a benefit of this change that we're kind of seeing in planning. So that was really encouraging. I think that when I think about having Bethel come next in line, the reason why it's attractive to me is the area has so much opportunity. But it also could be the opposite if we just don't do anything, right? It seems like a time that would highly benefit from some investments. And having you explain to us that, you know, even if we started today, this could, which isn't possible, we're looking at a multi-year process before anything would even start to happen. And I'm sure that this area, that's going to be difficult for them as it is. And they've started to kind of lay some of that groundwork for the plan as well, like River Road Santa Clara, which was really beneficial to the process. So that's all very encouraging. I also wanted to agree with what Councilor Groves was saying. I guess both of the gentlemen were saying about kind of looking at that Clear Lake area and not copying it, like you said, but it feels like a real opportunity for us to at least save a little time, right? And to look at some things that might work and get it done a little sooner. And I think it for me, it's also a high priority. As I look at this list, it's very daunting. It would have been nice to know which of these things are things we're required to do rather than things we've chosen to do. Some of them are kind of obvious, like we have to do building permits, right? But some of them were a little less. I don't know, that would have been nice. I'm out of time.
Oh, yes, you are. All right, Alan, then Mike.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks for that amazing presentation. There's an amazing amount of workload on PDD, obviously insufficient resources to get all the work that we need to do. I did not vote for the work session poll because I thought it was inappropriate and unfair to displace a neighborhood planning project where folks have been patiently waiting and quietly waiting, I'll add, for over, I think, 6 years now. As other urgent things bump them in the queue to get started on this project, it's been decades since anything's happened in any of the university neighborhoods in terms of planning in the 80s and the 90s when there were plans. So there's nothing recent that's been going on there at all. And the reason for that plan was because of the urgent pressures and impacts from student housing and short-term rentals that were being foisted onto these neighborhoods. And they have not gone away, folks. They're just worse because we haven't addressed them. We did address them sort of a little bit when we put in place the moratorium. That was a couple of years back, but that got largely displaced by the middle housing work that we just did. So I see different pressures and different opportunities in the Bethel neighborhood, and I appreciate the impacts that they're seeing, but I'm not seeing a rationale for saying to one part of the city, yet again, we're going to bump you and for a different project because you're not as important apparently, and not enough resources to go around. So you've been patient, you've been good team players, but sorry, we're gonna yet again bump you from the queue. I don't think the council wants to see the squeaky wheel process start again. And I don't think the council really wants to send a message that being patient's a good thing, that you should be annoying, that you should be loud, that you should not let anybody forget that you're in the queue. And I think that this is a horrible message to send to folks that have been patiently waiting for this process and constantly getting bumped. If there's a way to do this, they can get both started the same way, I think that's something that we should look at.
Okay, thank you. Mike and then Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. Couple of things. Number one, I too want to see the folks in Bethel get their area plan started as soon as possible, but I have to say, having sat there with him, I agree with everything Alan just said, that when the Santa Clara River Road planning was underway several years ago, it displaced the campus area of work that was being done because of the volume of the conversation at the time and the importance of the work. And I have to say, Councilor Zelenka very kindly, dealt with that by saying, okay, fine, you guys go first. I won't put up a big fuss. But the council at the time, and I know new councils can do as they like, but the council at the time pretty much promised that the campus area was next for neighborhood planning. And I just wanted to say, in all honesty, I remember that very clearly. So a previous council has given their word already about the order of this work. I want to say to PDD, great job. That's a big list. I don't envy the amount of work that you guys have to do without the resources to do it easily. I will say though, however, I may have missed it, but I did not see on any of the lists something that was a product of a work session we've now had 5 years ago on creating a plan for how do I want to say this? Creating a plan for incentivizing and inviting members to have voluntary annexation into the city. That's also going to come into play when we have revenue discussions. I'm very hopeful. And we left that work session with the staff would come up for a plan for inviting folks to voluntarily annex. And I'm hopeful that I just missed it there on the list somewhere, and that it's not, as Jennifer referenced, it's not just been dropped off along the way. Can you address that at all, Denny?
There probably is a few things that aren't on the list. For example, the U of O land swap that we're engaged in, that's taking a lot of our bandwidth, is not on the list, and we just kind of missed it. But I don't know. I'd have to go back and see what the action item that council took, or what commitment we have to come back with something. It's a little fuzzy to me because it's been some time, so I don't really have a clear response as to what we
didn't take a vote and direct staff or manager to X. It was the product of the discussion that this needs more preparation and study by planning to come back to council with an actionable thing. But again, that was, I asked for that work session poll at least 5 or 6 years ago and have been waiting patiently on that too. And I've referenced it a few times along the way. So as I suspect that will be something we'll talk about again soon, I'm hopeful that makes it on the list somewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg, and then Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and Denny and team. I want to thank you too for putting together this list. It's really important that we have a broad overview of what planning is doing now and what planning has done. In respect to my colleague, Councilor Zelenka, my priority is Bethel. And I know his priority is the university area. But for 41 years, we have not had a comprehensive neighborhood or area planning process in Bethel. And West Eugene has experienced some of the most rigorous level of growth in residential development, without the kind of commercial development that should be associated with that. Add to what Councilor Groves mentioned in terms of industrial development being positioned not just in close proximity to neighborhood development, but practically right next door to neighborhood development. in the Bethel area has caused us the situation we had with J.H. Baxter and potential situations with other industrial uses that affect neighborhoods and the health of our residents across the board, whether that be sound pollution or air pollution or other forms of pollution are critically important to the health and livability of the people in Bethel. I've lived in Bethel since 2000. I've lived all over the city in the last 36 years, and in River Road, Santa Clara as well. But, you know, when I moved into Bethel in 2000, and my wife and I bought our house in Bethel, we quickly realized that the level of planning and development for the area was sorely lacking. And if there is a way that we could come out of this with a plan to move forward, I'm more than happy to support that. I have 2 proposed motions that I floated earlier today to council, and I'm hoping that I will be able to get those motions out on the table for discussion. But I really kept them vague for the purposes of having that discussion. So hopefully we can be able to have a conversation and get some kind of resolution to move forward shortly.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you,
And then
Mayor.
Emily.
And thank you, city staff. This presentation makes it very clear how much work you all do to help us in our city. And I just want to quickly express my support for prioritizing the Bethel area. This is portion of my ward along 99, Train Song, and a portion of Bethel. And these neighborhoods have historically faced significant challenges with, being lower income, needing significant investment in their infrastructure, in planning what they want and need in their neighborhood. They're facing health issues due to industry, as Councillor Evans mentioned with J.H. Baxter. I'm supportive of our public health overlay concepts moving forward. And, I met with Homes for Good director at the new sponsors transitional housing site on 99 and Roosevelt recently, and they spoke to me about how they wanted to build a bigger building with more housing units, but they were not qualifying for additional funding to do so because there's no grocery store in the area. It's a food desert. Yet there's 2, gas stations that just moved in right across the street, making it 4 in a small area. It's evident to me that we need better planning in that area. And so to advocate for my constituents in my ward, I really would like to prioritize that area. So thank you.
Hey, thank you. Emily.
Thank you. Planning, I'm glad I'm not in you.
I don't have.
Yeah, every time it feels like there's blue sheets planning. So thank you for so very much work. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. In 2016, while I was campaigning, South Willamette area was undergoing some neighborhood planning, the South Willamette Special Area Zone, or as I call it, Swaziland. And it was very, very controversial, lots of meetings, lots of upset, neighborhood organizations, very unhappy. It took an enormous amount of energy. And things were progressing, and right when we were waiting for some information from planning, we didn't get it. And the next work session, Councillor Evans brought up that we should switch to Bethel and Santa Clara River Road, both of which I think are deserving, and yet I'm still sore about it. I was totally surprised And when I inquired as to the reasoning, Councilor Evans said he wanted to shake things up, which he did. Santa Clara River Road has their plan going. It's going really well. And I've said, I hope this becomes a template for other neighborhood plans because it has gone so very well. Not wanting you to come back to South Willamette, but one of the lessons is if you start a neighborhood plan, are you going to finish it? How are we going to prevent if something goes sideways, that we don't have this really controversial situation that ended up with a lot of people being very angry. So I do support Bethel, but I also have a lot of concern for Ward 3, which was going to be next and now has bumped down possibly 3 spaces. It's really hard. I don't want to put wards and neighborhoods in order, who's more important, who's needier. But I have a problem with these changes and that the university area also needs help. So I really have a dilemma, as which way to go with this. And I'm just happy to tell you how unhappy I am about how that went down. So let's not do it again. I'm totally into the health overlay zone. I think that's really critical. Wouldn't mind if it was the whole city. So that's my concern. How do we prevent another fiasco, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 counselors in the queue for a second round, but I want to jump in here. And the 2 things I would just welcome a little more specificity when you're thinking about how the public health overlay zone could be done with some code changes as opposed to zone changes, and how that might be more efficient and a little faster. Could you give us a little more specifics on that? I think it would be helpful.
Do you want me to answer that?
No, I can answer it, but I thought you were making a motion to me, so.
I was making a motion.
Not that kind of motion, but.
I do want to just say I am making some notes on the motions because I do have some things I want to say to clarify.
Okay. One of the ideas that we have been talking about is rather than rezoning all of those properties would be to actually just make some kind of surgical tweaks to the land use regulations. So there are tables. I'll give you lots of good details here. The land use code says what uses are allowed and not allowed in certain zones. We could not allow some of those uses like within a certain distance of residential, or we could just take them out of the land use code overall, or we could say, this use is allowed, but they have to do X, Y, and Z. And that is a much simpler, I'm not saying it's an easy process, but it is definitely much simpler than creating an overlay zone and applying an overlay zone, which requires rezoning all of the properties that it would be applied to.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say that when I first started talking to the neighborhood about public health overlay zone, one of my reasons to talk about that was that there were urgent issues around public health. And I did not want that process bogged down by being somewhere in the queue behind a lot of other neighborhood planning, recognizing same team has to do the work, but if there was a more efficient way. So I would just encourage my colleagues to think about that. If there's a way that the staff can do this faster and more surgically, that would be a benefit to the Bethel community who has been waiting for us to do this work. So that's my first pitch. And then the second thing is would love a little more clarity about your distinction that you're making between sort of a robust neighborhood planning process and the action plan, because again, I'm wondering if that gives us an opportunity for more overlap, thinking about short-term rentals, thinking about tree canopies, thinking about safe routes to school. If there's some overlaps there that might enable us again to end economic development. I'm taking Lindsay's point seriously about new gas stations opening and no grocery stores opening. If you could be a little clear about how are you seeing that sort of action plan versus the neighborhood planning?
And I'm going to tell you, I haven't spent a ton of time like writing out exactly what that would look like. But in my mind, with an action plan, it would be probably more involvement with some of the other, with some of the other departments. More, I mean, they are involved in neighborhood planning, but I think it would be kind of bringing all of those things into an alignment for that particular neighborhood, and then trying to prioritize, you know, what actions we can get through all together, and what are the priorities for that particular neighborhood. I think, and I think Councilor Simple alluded to this as well, I think when we start writing special area zones, doing a lot of new development standards, I think that's where it tends to, one, be really heavy on planning staff or consultants, and two, it tends to be where things get bogged down. And three, I'll just throw this out there, zoning doesn't necessarily make things happen, right? So we could zone something commercial, but it could just sit there. So what we really need are those next steps. You know, how's the sidewalk? Are there incentives to bring a business there? And so it's putting all of those pieces together. I think it could go quick. I'm not saying it, mine's all relative, right? What I say is relative. So I think it could go quicker, definitely, than how we have traditionally done neighborhood plans. And maybe this is just me thinking of my staff. It does kind of give me a little pause to think about trying to still do two of those, because then you've got, you know, I can't commit staff from other departments to be working on those either. So I totally, you know, my mind is kind of spinning around how we could, you know, get more done, you know, for different neighborhoods. I'm going to have to give it some more thought.
I guess, thank you.
Denny, do you have more?
I was just gonna add a couple of things. I think Council Simple made a really good point about when we hit that wall with the neighborhoods, and it's usually around things that tend to be more community-wide goals, like densification of corridors. That's something we want for the community because we need more housing and more density. It's not necessarily maybe what the neighborhood wants. And so those are the kinds of, so I think throwing those bigger things like zoning and land use into a citywide planning effort makes more sense. And that provides an opportunity. And we share Councilor Ye's enthusiasm for doing it different. Like there's opportunity really to go to a neighborhood and say, what do you really need? And let's work on that and not get stuck in the more community-wide bigger issues. And that opens up, I think, a whole lot of opportunity, different conversations that are, we stay in the fun zone longer, like all the visioning work and what do you need neighborhood, that's the fun part. And then when you go to codify all this land use stuff, it becomes less fun for everybody. And so if we could stay in that fun zone longer, I think we eliminate hitting that wall with their neighborhoods.
So I thank you. And I guess what I want to just put out, and it sounds like the city manager has some thoughts on this too. And for Greg, as you think about your motions, the language might matter here. If you hold us to a neighborhood plan, you're holding us to something very specific, but there is an option here that staff is presenting that's a little more nimble and gives us a little more flexibility to meet those needs without being confined. So just planting that seed with you. And then a third question, and it's really related to Alan's frustration about university and to the frustration that Emily has expressed and thinking about in the university areas. The question really is sort of the urbanization of those neighborhoods, those historic neighborhoods urbanizing. And that's not so different. I mean, it's kind of a different side of what we deal with downtown. Like, how do we urbanize? And those are citywide issues. So I'm also still looking for what might be the crossover in those more urban issues between the university neighborhood and even downtown and some of the other issues, hoping that, again, there might be some streamlining because, you know, it's a cluster, as I like to say. It's a cluster of issues and not wanting to neglect, which I think the university neighborhood has some serious concerns around the pace of urbanization and what's happening there. So thank you for that clarification. And now I have Matt, Jennifer, and Alan, and Greg and Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be quick on this one. In the bucket of the ongoing programs, I'm looking at the parking enforcement piece, and perfectly transparent and clear. I've told this story to some of you. I received a non-moving violation in Salem for expired tags that it was an election year, and they had lapsed, and I didn't realize it, and Salem got me like that. I suspect it's because the parking enforcement falls under the law enforcement bucket, in Salem versus Eugene, where the parking enforcement is, well, but whatever it is, Salem has a reputation for being on it. And I got around months clearly in Eugene. Now I've rectified it, but could we talk about the challenges with parking enforcement, but post-pandemic versus pre-pandemic? Are there staffing issues? Are there opportunities for generating revenue? Are there opportunities for maybe more clearly communicating with the community where and when, time, manner, place, folks should be parking long-term in an RV situation, if there's vehicular camping, for lack of a better term? This is kind of taking a deviation from the previous conversation, but the parking piece jumps out at me as a significant challenge. If we could just go over those and perhaps that even launch into a longer work session or longer conversation about parking.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask that you keep it brief because I know there's still a lot to get to here, and I'm hoping to leave here today with some clarity about what we do with Bethel.
Thank you. I may not take my remaining minute, so you've got that at least.
30 seconds.
But I'm very curious about the parking piece.
Jeff Petrie, the Curbside Admin Services Director, Parking Manager. During COVID, the parking fund lost 65, 75, 80% of its revenue within days. And so what we worked on is redeploying staff to other resources around the city, and many of those staff found jobs doing other work. So we had about a vacancy rate of 80% of our staff. At the same time, we stood up a new idea called a Neighborhood Services Officer Program to address some of the other issues around town. And so we also sucked off some staff. So we were down to 2 officers for a while. We're starting to slowly rebuild. It takes 6 months to 12 months to retrain officers. We're at 7 of our 11 right now. We're at 4 NSOs, neighborhood service officers. We have funding for 8, and we're working through that process. So we're still in the Operation Phoenix rebuilding. The program came down, and we're rebuilding, and we're slowly, as our revenue recovers, we're doing that. Expired tags has not been a priority for parking officers downtown. It is something that they have the ability to write on those citations. We do write plenty of expired tag citations. So it is a part that, as we're rebuilding the program, because it's a enterprise fund and we support our own services, we're slowly eking back up. That is the reason why it's been lower.
We'd be happy to give you a ticket.
Yeah.
The judge dismissed it. So I took care of it. Thank you, Jeff. I look forward to a longer conversation about parking. I appreciate jumping in there.
Okay, Jennifer, then Alan.
Yeah, I'm going to send you guys an email because I have some questions about other non-neighborhood things that I'll just not waste everyone's time on. But I like what I think the direction the mayor was talking about is how can we maybe solve some of these problems that are there ways to solve these problems that don't need a whole neighborhood planning process, that then folks could feel like they're getting the support they need? Because it sounds like in the university area, at least what Alan was mentioning was density, student housing, and short-term rentals. We already are working on short-term rentals. So that's kind of its own process that's happening, albeit it's kind of, we're collecting in data, but it's not like that's going to change if it gets moved into a neighborhood planning process. So it seems like that's kind of getting addressed. So maybe there's ways to work on, the student housing, some of that other stuff that doesn't need a full process. And then maybe also on the Bethel side as well. I think the reality for Bethel is that they've been under-resourced for a very long time. And they face unique challenges that many other neighborhoods, I know mine, we're a much more privileged area that doesn't have to deal with the industry and health issues. And we've heard about even lifespan differences, like from this data that Bethel is a very unique area that deserves attention. And when we have council goals around equity, I find it hard to not figure out a way to address this neighborhood's needs in some way, because they're not needs that are already being addressed somewhere else. I mean, like we've heard, Councilor Leach say, they need a grocery store, right? Changing the code to allow a grocery store is not going to solve that problem. It needs more work to like, how are we going to attract those businesses to be in that area when they could be somewhere else that might be easier and more affluent and all that, you know? So I don't know what the solution is to get everyone what they need, but Bethel needs to jump the line in some way. We need to address this. At least that's where my vote's going to be.
Okay, thank you. Alan and then Greg.
Well, I haven't seen the motions because they were done in an attachment, didn't open. So I would suggest next time they become in text. Could someone send those out as an email so we could read them before they go forward? I very much appreciate the need for and the under-resourcing that's been happening in Bethel for a long time and a need for planning. But Mike Clark's correct. When River Road bumped the university 5-6 years ago, we graciously stepped aside and said, yes, that would be fine, with the assurance that we would be next. The neighborhood livability, the impacts on the university area, all the neighborhoods surrounding it because of the university are unparalleled to any other neighborhood. And they have been for a long time. That's why we spent a lot of time on it back then, put a moratorium in place, and all those things didn't go away. They're just still there. And we've been waiting patiently for it. In particular, the neighborhood livability and the density and the redevelopment that's going on. And all of that needs to be addressed, especially as the university proceeds with more students. I'm surprised that the council would renege on a promise, especially after University area graciously acquiesced and agreed to allow River Road and Santa Clara to go forward if we would be next. So that's quite surprising to me. I think both of these plans, Bethel and the university, will take some time to do. I'm wondering, staff, if there's, with fairness in mind, is there a way to start both of these, maybe along the lines of what the mayor was talking about in terms of the issues, as opposed to neighborhood plans, which take an inordinate amount of time and necessarily will exclude one for the other. So is there a way to accommodate this so that we can move forward and address issues as opposed to creating neighborhood plans? Because I think that's the way forward here.
So I'm going to jump in here because I think it's tied very closely to the conversation we're going to have next week around budget. So what I would recommend is, like, sitting here today, I would say it would be very challenging to start both of these plans at the same time, given without scoping exactly what it is we mean. So given that River Road Santa Clara is not going to wrap up until January, I think my recommendation would be we get through next week. We get through the kind of like understand where we're at with the budget, understand what our gap is next year, clarify the costs of what it is we're talking about, you know, when we scope this out. And then I think we're ultimately, based on everything I know financially, will be faced with a choice, which is you either choose one to go first or the other, or we look at repurposing some other city funds to be able to do both. And it's not a little. I asked this question about a year ago. I think when this first came up, like, what would it cost for us to staff up and just do neighborhood planning? And it was somewhere in the order of $500,000 just to get, like, okay, we're going to start doing that, even if we work with a consultant. So we don't have $500,000 at the moment to do that with. And I don't know if that's the right cost. So I think we have a little bit of time to work through it to understand what that would be. But without that time, there's no way we could commit today to doing them both at the same time, as much as I would want to.
Okay. Do you have a follow-up, Alan, or are you done?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thanks. All right. Greg, then Randy, then Lindsay.
Okay, well, I've been playing with my motions as we've gone through this discussion. So what I would like to do is to propose my first motion, and it's different than the one that I wrote out a few hours ago. And the motion would be this. I move to direct the city manager to prioritize a citywide planning process for a public health overlay zone with emphasis on West Eugene.
Second.
Okay,
I want to clarify, Alyssa, that's not what the fix we were talking about.
No, it's not an overlay.
So this is a
zone.
bigger,
Yeah, this would,
so
my understanding of the motion is it's,
This would be
right, it's
bigger.
rezoning property.
this is,
Yeah.
so, yeah, so
Citywide.
just to, I'm gonna say that a little louder just to make sure. So this is would be a citywide rezoning process for a public health overlay zone, Greg, that's what you're asking for.
That is, yeah, that is the gist of my motion.
So you want to do the zoning process.
Yes.
Okay, and it's seconded. All right. All right. Yeah, Jennifer, do you
I
want to
just want
speak
to
to
make sure
that?
I understand.
Yeah.
So that means that staff can't bring back the other idea that you had? Is that?
Yeah.
Because that sounded like it might be a good idea.
I'm trying to be as broad and as vague as I possibly can to give staff the flexibility to address the issues that are raised with the public health overlay zone.
So I think the response you're getting from staff is that this is locking us into a specific kind of zoning process. So it is broad, but it is not vague.
so I'll just clarify, what Alyssa was talking about in terms of Alyssa and Denny were talking about in terms of, the launching even a West Eugene public health overlay zone, whole process or citywide process. That's essentially, we'll be waiting until we get through with River Road, Santa Clara. And then we will have to deploy a team to do this work specifically. And that will go on for a lot because we're going to be notifying every property owner in Eugene. It's just a big, big project. So what we were instead proposing was if the strongest issue is that concern about J.H. Baxter, we think we could actually do a small fix to do that and then move on to the next neighborhood plan, whichever that is, when we're done with River Road, Santa Clara. So it's a way of trying to do both as opposed to we finish River Road, Santa Clara, we move on to public health overlay, then we move on to neighborhood planning. So this would be a big project. So you wouldn't be doing both of those at the same time, Counselor Ye?
And I would be willing to modify my motion to accommodate what Sarah just said.
Okay, give us a second and we'll come up.
Okay, so we'll craft one for you in that case.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, so do you
I
want
was
to
gonna
speak to that
to
anyway?
the
Okay,
motion.
Randy and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. And I really appreciate what Councilor Ye has been saying on the, I was trying to, on the fly, come up with some language that would give staff a little more flexibility in bringing us back maybe a couple of options. And I personally, I would like to see this encompass a larger area than just Bethel. I'm very much concerned about the rail yard that's in Councilor Leach's ward and the effects on River Road. I think the picture is broader than what we are even painting it here, but I do want to be responsive to our Bethel community. And I'm channeling Catherine's predecessor, Glenn Klein. When it went back in the day when I was on staff, I used to go to him and tell him what I wanted him to do for me. And he'd say, how about you tell me what you want to accomplish and let me figure out how to get you there. And so I'm trying to remember that here today, where you might have solutions that cover everything we're trying to accomplish. But as lay people, we don't have your depth or breadth of knowledge. So I would like to hear what you have to say when you come back. If there's a faster way to accomplish the same things, I mean, I don't know how I couldn't support that. It's the outcomes that I'm interested in, and that's protecting people in our community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I actually want to let Lindsay step in because she was in the queue before that. Lindsay, do you want to speak at this moment now or
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to reiterate that I'm a big fan of efficiency, getting things done when, more quickly than we might be able to do with a full planning refinement process. If I would be, interested in hearing from staff as well on how we could achieve those same goals, but with that in mind, still having the process of a lot of community engagement. And I think that's part of that neighborhood planning process that I don't want to lose is really spending that time talking to the people and really figuring out what the needs are and how to get there. But like Councilor Groves just said, if we can do that in a better, more efficient way, I would be on board. So thank you.
Thank you. And Alan, comment?
Yeah, maybe there's a way to tweak that motion to, Greg, maybe to have staff bring back a plan to do a citywide planning on process for public overlay zone with an emphasis on West Eugene. I understand the prioritization for that, but were you planning just to make one motion, or are you planning to make another motion?
Yeah, I am planning to make another motion, and I've also amended the second motion as well. So that would be inclusive of Bethel and University, but I'm not there yet.
So
to do what? Because if I did this process, this motion would kind of bump all of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we have a proposed motion from staff.
I don't actually have a
You don't?
proposal
Okay.
because I was going to go in the same direction. It's really hard to sit here and try to write a motion and also be present and listen to the conversation. So what I heard, the first motion was citywide process, and then I heard Councilor Evans say he was amenable to what I said. And so I think what would actually be more effective would be to bring you back a proposal that, like, here's what we would propose based on the conversation, and you can vote on the whole thing, and it can, it's just hard to do it right here and listen.
Yeah.
I'm open to withdrawing my motion based on that recommendation.
Right.
And,
Okay.
yeah, and
a
I
second.
still have
Second.
Or
Okay.
I still have the floor, Mayor. I'm glad you'll do that, Greg. Involved in that is, the reality is we have these legacy refinement plans, and they have a lot of value, and they create certainty. Investment follows certainty, so that's a good thing. So, but we're just not going to do more refinement plans. We don't have the resources, and we don't have the time. If we were going to do refinement plans for the rest of the neighborhoods, it would take us hundreds of years. And so we need to think of a different way of doing this. We can't have neighborhood by neighborhood plan anymore, because we just don't have the resources to do that. So I guess I would challenge Sarah, when you come back with staff's proposal, to think about that too, and how would we accomplish some of this stuff and the pressures that are happening within different neighborhoods? How do we address those issues without going immediately to the default? Let's do a whole refinement plan, spend 5 years doing that over here, to the detriment of every other neighborhood in the city, because that's just not going to work. And it's not going to get us very far. And so I guess I would challenge staff to bring back something that helps us address some of the issues along the lines of what the mayor was talking about, where we address issues as opposed to specific neighborhood plans. Thanks.
Thank you. So I want to, Greg, I'm looking to you. I know you have a second motion, but I'm wondering if, having heard what Sarah has suggested around, we have a budget meeting next week, staff can come back. If you want to hold on that motion as well, and so that staff has an opportunity to come back with some more thoughtful response, and there is time. I'm wondering if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, Mayor, I can do that. I think that what we want to do is to try to accommodate the goals that I'm trying to outline and articulate, and get somewhere, as Alan just mentioned. We're resource constrained right now as far as staff is concerned. And if we can find a better way to address the issues that are plaguing our individual neighborhoods in a more comprehensive way, I'm in favor of that. And I'm in favor of having staff go back and look at how they can craft something that would be amenable to the entire council, that we could all get our heads around and support.
Okay, thank you very much. Are we leaving this in a clear enough pathway?
Yeah, I mean, what I feel like we're coming back with is a proposal for how we would do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I really want to thank counselors for all your thoughtful questions and problem solving here. I really appreciate staff and the clarity with which you've sort of presented this information, because it's a lot to sort of wrap our heads around. And I'm grateful to all of you for, having the opportunity to come back and talk about this with a little more information and a proposal from staff. So with that, thank you all very much, and we are adjourned.